Good afternoon, Brent. How you doing?
Hey, Bob, doing well. How are you?
Hey, pretty good. So, just for an introduction, I'm Bob Frasure. I'm an AI technology specialist, and Brenton is a good colleague of mine. Brenton, you've been in the technology innovation space inside of healthcare as well, and I've been working with you for the past few years. You want to give a little introduction?
Yeah. My name is Brenton Hefner. As Bob said, I'm a healthcare innovation strategist. Tend to focus on the introduction of new cutting edge technologies to address healthcare needs across the physical and behavioral health space. Um, and really have very wide ranging interests that I think we'll probably cover some of in this discussion.
I did want to start off talking a little bit about artificial intelligence and how it stands in the year 2024. Right, we're only in the month of March, and we've seen many different models being released. Some in the open source space, some commercially, but either way, they're all very powerful. They're in some ways a little bit concerning at how powerful they are. We've seen the latest NVIDIA Blackwell chip being released and the subsequent systems that it sits in. We're talking about several hundred times the speed of previous chips in its category. And these are the chips that are going to be powering AI. So certainly there's a lot of change happening right now. I can't even imagine what this recording will look like 6 months from now. But we are truly living in an amazing time, and certainly a time that is seeing the acceleration of technology like I've never before even considered. Being that we are both technologists and we both have a lot of experience in the healthcare space, I want to focus a little bit on the healthcare space for right now, because that's one of the few areas that really needs a lot of tech innovation, right? We've seen a lot of tech innovation elsewhere. Certainly there's a lot that has approached healthcare over the past century, maybe 2 centuries. But yet somehow healthcare remains a little bit backwards, right? We're still dealing with paper. We're still dealing with faxing. Not a whole lot of AI in the space. So what are your thoughts on the current state of AI and how it impacts healthcare and the healthcare industry?
I think back to supply chain in college, and I remember my professor made a point that's always stuck with me. And he said, something can be better, or it can be faster, or it can be cheaper, or it can be a combination of the two, or of two of the three, but there's got to be a compromise somewhere. And that's certainly true, except when a technology comes along that pushes the tide in a direction that lifts all of the ships. And I think what's fascinating about AI is that it does have the ability to reduce costs. It has the ability to improve outcomes and certainly increase the velocity of product and service delivery. So I think it's a very interesting time to be around because we're going to see all of those things, and we already are seeing them. One of the other things that comes to mind, and Bob, I think you would have some great thoughts on this, is I remember when AI first became something that was practical to talk about. I was listening to an interview with Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and they were addressing the displacement of the workforce and what is AI going to do to the workforce and how does that affect us. And they drew a great comparison that I think is really important to remember. And they mentioned that in 1831 or 1830, I guess, prior to the introduction of the McCormick Reaper, 80% of the United States economy was based on agriculture. And within 100 years, by 1931, that number had decreased to 20% or less. And what's interesting is the economy strengthened from there. It didn't disrupt us, it didn't lead us into stagnation, but people had the capacity to focus on higher order activities because there was so much more efficiency. And so I think from a broad standpoint, what we're going to see is an increase in the value of the products and services that we're delivering. But we're also going to see an increase in the value of human capital And that's contingent upon this being channeled in a way that's accretive to society, of course. And we think we're going to talk about the ethical implications and some of the ways that there can be pitfalls, but that's my optimistic outlook.
Yeah, and you know, it's always interesting when people talk about the ethical implications. I mean, we've seen lately how Gemini is trying its absolute best to avoid the ethical, I should say, to avoid ethical issues, and in some cases, they've overachieved their goal. Right? There's been plenty of times in the past where AI has gotten ethics wrong. Right? It will, with the incorrect training data, it'll go out. It'll look through a bunch of data. It'll pick out, the person of a certain skin color, right, as the person who was involved in the crime. But it's just simply because that was the data set that it was looking at. And so we've got a bunch of companies out there, Gemini, we've got the Claude model, OpenAI, Grok. Each of these companies are doing their absolute best to keep the AIs ethical, and yet there are still some private large language models floating around, which are absolutely unethical. Right? They'll enable people to do things that they really shouldn't. And so, with all of the ethics and the implications of ethics that are involved in these AIs. What's your perspective on the current state of affairs, the AIs, and where they stand from in healthcare from an ethics perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the most important question to be asking because at the end of the day, as far as sustainability of the technology, we've got to get that right. And I don't think that we can afford massive errors, but there will be errors that we need to learn from. One of the things that I think is really important, and Bob, I think you probably have some great thoughts on this, is that people need to treat AI as something that informs their own decisions and something that complements their thought processes and gives them more information to execute from. But I think it gets very, very dangerous when people offload the responsibility for making decisions and thinking critically to the AI, right? And so it's kind of like if I would never use Google to make a decision for me. I would use it to very quickly curate information that helps inform what decision I make. But I don't expect Google to make any decisions on my behalf. I think what creates a pitfall about LLMs is that you do have the experience of conversing with something that you trust, even though it's still a generative application. And so I think that people start to treat it as though it's this weird mixture of a magic 8 ball and God. And really, we need to contextualize it more as an encyclopedia that's very dynamic, I think. I feel like it's very important that we don't treat these things as though they're humans and they're these wise counterparts that you're discussing with, because at the end of the day, they're algorithms. They're amalgamating information, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's actually a really good point that putting that trust into an AI is going to be, I think, it's both it's the positive side of large language models. It's also the boon of the large language models, right? We want healthcare professionals to have access to these, but at the same time, we don't want the large language model making the choice or making the decision. We need to put the power of the final decision in the hands of the healthcare professional. And it's really all professionals. It's all professionals in every industry. But I got to tell you, I hear it a lot, either from the engineers or from the end users that would love to turn the keys over to the large language model or an AI in general. They would love to step back and let the AI do everything that it's supposed to do. And then if it has issues, drop those issues out. But I think the issue is that sometimes the AIs don't realize that they're having a problem, right? They are making a perfectly legitimate decision. But I'll tell you right now, the most difficult thing I've had to deal with in the AI space, and I've been doing this, I'll say professionally, since 2017, right? Before before it was cool. And I've had a lot of problems in many, many different projects implementing AIs, just simply for that reason alone. When we begin to put false trust into these AIs, and this is before large language models were really popular, they would disappoint. And one error out of 100 doesn't sound like a lot, but in the healthcare space, it could be life or death. It could it could really ruin someone's, day, month, year, or life. It's pretty amazing. And so, um, large companies will get involved in these initiatives, right? And large teams will get involved in these initiatives and put all of their faith into an AI, and yet the AI would fail them time and time and time again. And so, with that, I'd see many teams fold. So I'm a little more caution. Yeah, I'm a little more cautious, and I think that's actually been the reason why I've survived over the years in this space is I will not move forward until um, we implement a solution that is extremely conservative, and that really keeps the human in mind. But one of the other issues I've seen is that AIs, especially in the healthcare space, will have access to very personal information. By personal information, I mean cancer, right? Cancer diagnosis, or even worse, right? Information that could ruin someone's career, that could ruin someone's um, trajectory, for instance. This information should not get out. It is extremely private. We've got people that have not given their consent to these healthcare companies to let AIs crawl all over the information, or much less train off of it. And yet there are organizations, fortunately not ones that we worked with, but there are organizations that are putting this information into AIs, right? What are your thoughts on the privacy concerns around AI? And what we're looking at right now, what we're looking at moving forward.
Yeah, it's powerful. One of the immediate implications that comes to mind is we've all had the experience of having a conversation with a friend that's kind of off the wall. And I love studying psychology and the brain recreationally. And I'll go to a friend's house and have dinner, and we'll start talking about a subject that's interesting, like schizophrenia. And then all of a sudden, my YouTube feed will be full of advertisements for schizophrenia medications because it thinks that maybe this is something that I'm experiencing. And you can use any condition or disease state or product, and you can fill that in. We've all had that experience. Um, I think the advertising implications are pretty significant, and even in a world where, Bob, we deal with sensitive data all the time, but we anonymize it, and so we're looking at mass amounts of data, tons of sensitive line items, but we don't have a patient name, or sometimes we don't even have a member number. We just have instances of data points that we can use to make inferences from. I mean, even if we're not linking that data back to individuals, it's still powerful and it still creates a tremendous amount of influence that organizations can have. And we have to prepare for a world where that influence is not always going to be positive. We hope that it is. We can imagine that, but sometimes it's not positive, and sometimes it intends to be positive, but it ends up being misleading, or it creates an issue because it is so effective. And so I think it's very easy to be optimistic about, from a diagnostic standpoint, we're going to have fewer false positives, fewer false negatives when it comes to discerning what an underlying condition is from symptomology. But I think when it comes to driving business imperatives and responding to consumer behavior, it's possible that we could kind of overshoot the mark of positivity and business evolution. And if we don't have some constraints and regulations in place, we could potentially be too effective in how we're marketing certain care protocols to our target market.
Yeah, and by the way, I will actually add a little more on to the privacy concerns. Being that I deal with a lot of AI lab type work and experimentation, this is something that you and I have talked about over the years. Is we are not able to do what we want in the healthcare space with the data that we actually have access to. Right? I think we this has been a challenge. We'll put on a number of presentations to different teams. They'll get excited. We will begin to procure the right technologies to do the artificial intelligence work. We'll build the software, but in the end, we can't touch the data that we are actually looking to work with. We are extremely cautious with this data. Right? I've been in the industry for well over 20 years now. Um, and the one thing I've learned about healthcare is it is extremely protected. There are plenty of people who don't share that same sentiment, and plenty of organizations that do not share that same sentiment as well. And I think there's going to be need for better governance. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
We love thinking about this and thinking about the potentials, and so it comes naturally. I know that I'll be exercising, I'm thinking about this, and I have ideas, but it takes a lot of time. You have to really spend time working through the cogs of complexity. And I think we have to grant that not everybody shares our passion for sitting there and really forecasting this out. And so a lot of the negativity and some of the malignance that could come along, I think is incidental and it's not deliberate. It's just if you're going to spend, the hour Zoom meeting that you have scheduled thinking about this issue, it's not enough time. You've got to really let your mind wander into different places and look at the landscape of potentials. And so I think we need to have thought leaders that are informing what the regulatory environment looks like, because we can't expect everybody that we're working with to have that same passion and carry it out to the extent that we're really going to predictably avoid some of the pitfalls that we can encounter and that we will encounter. And Bob, we know that we're not going to predict everything. In any innovation, you have to approach catastrophe in order to realize how impactful an error can be. And there are going to be those instances without a doubt.
Yeah, yeah, definitely agree. And you'd mentioned something about markets earlier. One of the things that we know about markets is that each market in healthcare targets a different socioeconomic group. Right? We may be dealing with children. We may be dealing with the elderly, right? Also known as long-term care, right? And there are a number of other groups as well. How do you see AI helping to balance the offerings and the care and the really the attention that's given to each of these different groups to make them more equitable?
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to this. I'm going to try to be brief because honestly, I think that you and I could talk about this for 2 hours or more. There's a book that I recommend to everyone, and I used to have 4 copies on my shelf, but I buy them and I give them away to friends when it comes up because it's just so important. It's called The Brain That Changes Itself, and it's about neuroplasticity. It's written by a great doctor named Norman Doidge. I recommend it to everyone. Um, Something that stands out from that book that I think is relevant is, and it's talking about how our experiences shape the structure of our brains. Autopsies have been done by people who grow up in inner city environments that have a hostile nature to them or a prevalence of violence and crime. And they've found that in some instances, the people who have passed away and who the autopsy has been done on and the brain examination, um, because they've spent so much time in this environment with hostility and violence and threat, the fight or flight response has been activated so often that the amygdala is overdeveloped. And so the amygdala is actually bigger than it would be in somebody who grew up in a less aggressive environment. And the implication for that is when we look at how violence propagates across certain areas and we're kind of wondering, is it just culture? Is it a lack of education? Is it some other variable? Well, it can actually be structural changes in the brain that have responded as an evolutionary impact of the experiences that you've had. And how this correlates to the question that you asked is that when I learned something like that, now all of a sudden I realize that there is a healthcare and a medical implication to solving for some of the societal issues that we're experiencing and that we're grappling with. And it takes compassion, consideration, and investment in order to address those things. I'm a big believer in the free market, but I also recognize that we need to have a human approach to defining the problems that we're addressing, and we need to have understanding for the people who are experiencing those issues. And I think when we introduce data, and we process it through AI, we're going to find these correlates that really create objective inferences and insights that create a much more compelling story for why we should make investments and how we make those investments. I think that our economic investment in addressing social issues is going to become much more justified as AI validates the premises for making those, if that makes sense.
It makes great sense. And I think the important thing about AI is that it's the all knowing, all seeing technology. I'm not sure if anybody's seen the videos, and maybe I can throw one in here of some of the vision AI tools out there that will look at large groups of people in the city of New York, or large batches of cars in heavy traffic, and it'll pick out every single vehicle, and it'll get details on every single vehicle all at once. And I think if I heard you correctly, that this technology will basically recognize what's happening across all the different socioeconomic markets that are served in healthcare, and get the insights that really would just take too much effort for people to generally do on their own. Is that right, or did I get that right?
Completely. And I think also generate insights that we're not even really capable of. If you think about some of the more problematic environments that we know of in the United States, an entrepreneur would love the opportunity to tap into high value human capital from those areas. You would love that. I mean, if you could hire people from those areas, and if you knew how to drive interventions that decrease drug use, for instance, or decreased violence to the point that the populations didn't have high criminal records and felony rates and things like that. I mean, that's very, very valuable, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on or where you land ideologically. It's just better and it's additive. In order to make a compelling argument and show that there's going to be ROI through your investment, through your tax investment, and rolling out public programs and things, you need to have some kind of validation behind it to know that you're not just throwing darts at the broadside of a barn. And I think that AI is really going to help us target our resources towards outcomes that are economically additive.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And along with this, you and I both know that with all of these great advancements will come a lot of training. Right, in healthcare, there's one thing that is for sure, is that it is not run by a bunch of young tech startup types. Right, healthcare is usually run by people who have had hands-on clinical access to patients throughout the years, right? And they are oftentimes people first. Even though healthcare in many cases is an information technology industry, it is still a it is still a people first organization, right? And industry. And so with AI and its impact that is going to be coming to healthcare, what do you see are the important aspects of training that'll be required for healthcare professionals to really utilize the benefits of AI as it stands today, and as well as anything that's on the horizon?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that point kind of segues into the pitfalls and what we should consider avoiding in um, the pitfalls of introducing this type of technology. One of the things I think we found, Bob, is that the some of the leaders that we've spoken to about technology are very enthusiastic about the general idea of it. When it comes to actually implementing and rolling that technology out, there's a big black box that many people have not yet defined for themselves or come to a consensus on, as far as how do we need to fill that box in, from an innovative standpoint. I think that the starting point is AI adjacency. For me, that seems to be the path of least resistance. Is let's not try to impact headcount immediately. Let's not try to automate everything. Those feel to me like ideas of grandeur that are kind of far off. Now, far off in the tech world could be months, or it could be a year, or 2 years, or 3 years. It doesn't have to be a decade or more, but I don't think that that's what we do from day one. I think that what we do is enhance people's potential through introducing these LLMs that are safe to use and that have proprietary data that we would otherwise take a long time to mine. And we potentiate our existing human capital to do more. And I think where that kind of ties back to the question that you asked on education and training is that, and my father has spent his career in the heavy equipment industry and trucking, and he's a commercial truck dealer. And one of the things that's interesting about mechanics these days is that without a computer, there's not much you can do. So you and I remember or knew of mechanics. My grandfather was a mechanic, and owned an auto shop. He could solve any issue that existed with a car. And on my dad's family road trips or growing up rather, they'd be driving on the freeway in some desolate area and someone would be pulled over and he'd pull out his toolbox and he'd fix it.
Right.
And in the world that we live in today, the automotives are so complex that without a diagnostic tool, that exists in a computer, there's not much that you can do. You basically need a tow truck, and I think that we really need to avoid the pitfalls of offloading domain expertise onto AI, so that our practitioners don't become helpless, because we still need them to be we need them to become more familiar with anatomy and with physiology and disease states than they ever were before. And AI needs to potentiate that familiarity and make them more independently strong and capable. We don't want to go in the direction of offloading the responsibility for critical thinking onto the software, so that the physician basically becomes, the proxy actor of the AI. We want it to be the other way around. The AI is potentiating the physician is not enabled solely through the AI. And I think there's a very real risk of that occurring.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I know that we're running low on time, but I do want to touch into some of the more philosophical aspects. And this is what I think is just great about working with you. And I've always enjoyed it. Is your brain is not just on the technology or the innovation; it's also on the philosophy behind it. Are we building something that we cannot control, and are we building something that we need to have a little more responsibility over? And this is just across the entire AI domain right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we are building something that could certainly get away from us without a doubt. I don't think that that's inevitable though either. It feels like, disappointingly, it feels like kind of a foregone conclusion for a lot of tech leaders as they talk about it, and they kind of throw up their hands and say, "Well, what does AI need us for anymore?" And or what will AI need us for anymore? And I feel like that's kind of a sophomoric thought. That's sort of like saying the subway can run without passengers. And it's like, yeah, it can, but what's the point? There's no point in the subway operating without people on it. And without conscious human observers to be impacted by artificial intelligence, the AI doesn't, the AI has no purpose. It serves no purpose. We have to remember that life is the most rare commodity in the universe as far as we know. And this is meant to increase the quality and quantity of time of life, not serve as a substitute for it. That there's There's a book that I'd recommend to everyone. It's called The Clockwork Universe, and it's about Isaac Newton's life. And there's this amazing section in it, and they're talking about how societal understanding follows a certain sequence. And the example that they use is that we know that there was a time when when the religious institutions propagated the idea that the earth was at the center of the universe and everything basically existed to subordinate the earth. And that was based on philosophical and religious ideas that were societally important. And then Copernicus and Galileo came along and did work that suggested and proved that that wasn't necessarily the case. There was a different design to the universe. And Isaac Newton came along and proved through science and theory that that was the case, and took us in new directions than we previously could have been able to go in. What's fascinating is that Darwin came along, I think about 175 years after Isaac Newton in terms of the influence of his work. And this author makes a great point, and he says we could not have begun to understood the idea that biological changes occur across generations if we didn't first understand that we weren't at the center of the universe. We had to learn the physics before we could learn the biology. But it took 175 years of people sitting there and just kind of settling in with this idea that maybe we weren't at the center of the universe. And one of the philosophical questions that I have is, as AI comes along and correlates all of this data that we previously didn't see as being related, and we have all of these new groundbreaking inferences that are going to come from it, are we going to societally adopt those in a way that's mature and doesn't completely compromise our stability so that we can keep adding to our human understanding of the universe? Or is it going to be destabilizing? And I think that that's kind of an important thing to think about is we can learn new things all the time. Bob, you could tell me things about myself that are maybe displeasurable and say, change your inflection, or you're being boring, or maybe you should use a better word here, or this, that, or the other. But I can't integrate all of those at once. I can only do so many things at one time that constitute a change in how I see myself foundationally. And I think we're going to see a lot of things that emerge from our understanding through AI that change how we fundamentally see life. And that to me is kind of a big concern is we can't destabilize things in the process of evolving.
One, two, three, four.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brenton Hefner, Tech Innovations, especially in healthcare space. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. This is a pleasure.
All right.